Welcome to the Story a Day podcast. This is Julie Duffy, encouraging you to be a writer today, not someday. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Julie here from Story a Day, and I'm recording this at the end of September, and the season is definitely changing. I think a lot of us are feeling it now. No matter where you live, I think the seasons are changing. So I also think for a lot of writers this time of year, certainly in my hemisphere, feels like New Year for nerds, right? It's when schools started back, universities started up. The fall just seems like a time to settle down and learn something new or focus on a new project. So we start to become aware of the fact that there's only a few months left till the end of this year. It's natural to get a little reflective at this time of the year or start to panic when you think about all the things that you planned to do this year and hadn't done yet. So let's talk about that. I did a really useful exercise this week which touched on this kind of thing. And there was a step. This was something that I discovered from a woman called Kate Northrup, who talks about energy and women's energy in particular in terms of organising your life and your work and working with your own rhythms. And the exercise that she laid out for you at the change of the seasons was to reflect on the previous season. Not the whole year, not everything that you failed to do this year. Just reflect on the previous season and answer the usual kinds of questions that you would think of. What did I achieve? What did I miss and why? What did I learn from the things that I achieved and from the things that I didn't? What did I really want to focus on last season, so for the last 3 months maybe? And did I do that? And then only after you've done that reflection and given yourself credit for all of the things that you did in the face of all of the things that you had to endure or encounter or also do, only after you've reflected on that, then you start to answer questions like, what do I want to take with me into the next season? What do I want to leave behind? And then you can start to plan. So I'd encourage you to, if you're thinking about planning for the last quarter of the year, if that's how your brain works, and you're like, well, the next, it's a useful sort of amount of time to plan. So if you're thinking about planning for the next quarter of this year before it comes time for New Year's resolutions and a whole new year and blah, 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 then think about, first of all, looking back and really reflecting on what you've achieved. If you were taking part in Story a Day September, I can promise you have achieved something in the last month. And if you go back as far as July and really think about everything that's happened since then, if you keep a journal, this will be a great time to go and flip through it. Because 3 months ago, this year especially, a couple of weeks seems like a decade. So going back 3 months and flipping back through your journal or scrolling back through your photo stream or whatever you do to jog your memory, going all the way back to July, a lot's happened in the last 3 months in your life, I'm willing to bet. Even if it doesn't seem like it, I look back to July and I'm like, oh yeah, I did all those things. Like I launched the iWriter course and I ran through it for 6 weeks with a bunch of awesome writers who I learned a lot from. And they got a ton out of it. I'm pretty sure because they told me. I just don't want to sound immodest, but they did the work themselves. So, but that's something that I'd almost dismissed, even though it was a ton of work and all of us got a lot out of it. Because if I started to look forward, I was like, okay, what's next? And I almost forgot to stop and pause and say, you know what? The reason that you were a little tired at the beginning of September was because you did this thing, you made this thing, and you had this wonderful experience with all of these people. And take a breath and give yourself some credit and think about the lessons learned from that and how I can take those into the next iteration of that course, which will be coming up soon, and how I can take the lessons learned from that into my work. What would I like my working day to look like when I'm writing, based on what I've learned about how I work the last 3 months. So change of seasons is a wonderful time because energy sort of changes, and it's a wonderful time to step back and reflect on what you have achieved, what things went really well and what you learned from that, what things didn't go so well and what you learned from that. What did you write? What did you read? Just, take a moment to reflect on that before you start to plunge into that more sort of adrenaline pumping, here's what I want to achieve before the end of the year part of your planning process. So that's what I've been thinking about this month. I thought today on the podcast, though, I would just share with you some things that I've enjoyed this month or in the last quarter, and some things that you might have missed online that I found useful. So the first thing I wanted to talk about, I was a huge fan of the TV show The Good Place, and I tried to get everybody I knew to watch it, and I told them to watch the whole of the first season before they even spoke to anybody about it, for reasons that will be clear to you if you've watched it or if you've heard anything about it. So it ended this year after 4 years, and it ended really well. But one of the things I really enjoyed about The Good Place, the podcast, The Good Place was The Good Place, the podcast, where the actors, writers and crew came on every week and talked about the show, how it was produced. It was a wonderful celebration of creativity, and I got tons of tips from writers of the show about the process, and just, hearing professional television writers talking about their process, which can't really be precious, right? They have a show that they're writing and it has to get written, so they have to figure out ways to get through all of the blocks and insecurities and stuff that all of us suffer. So, and just hearing how the stories came together was really fascinating. What I particularly enjoyed was the 2-part podcast about the finale of the show, because they had the show creator and the writer of the episodes, Mike Schur, came on and talked about how he developed the ideas that went into the end of this epic story, and how he worked on it. And I just found it so encouraging that, just like the rest of us, he knew what he wanted to do. He didn't know if he was going to be able to do it. He had retreated to a hotel room by a beach and put on some music and just worked at it until he had it, which is just, very familiar and quite reassuring. So I highly recommend The Good Place, the podcast, especially that 2-part sequence, I guess, about the finale of writing the finale of the show. That's one thing that I really enjoyed. I wanted to let you know as well that I have if you don't already read the Writer Unboxed blog, what's wrong with you? No, I'm kidding. But the writerunboxed.com blog is an absolutely wonderful blog for writers. It's a group blog started by Therese Walsh, written by many, many regular contributors. I am fortunate to be an occasional contributor to that site, and I have a new post that went up this week all about how to write titles for stories and potentially for novels as well. And there's a lot of good comments. It's a very active blog, so there's always a ton of comments and people talking about how they deal with this, whether titles come naturally to them or whether they don't. So I went through this method where I sort of analysed a whole bunch of short story titles and put out a bunch of ways to think about what your title achieves. And so I know a lot of people, sometimes for some people titles come really easily. For others it's like, I don't know, I just want to call it the story, and then they sort of freeze and don't know how else to think about it. So I've created this article which has multiple ways in for you to think about what you want your title to achieve, how to approach it, multiple options, sort of plug and play. You can think about it this way, you can think about it that way. So I'd recommend you go over to the Writer Unboxed blog and have a look for that one. I'll put a link in the show notes. Another article that came up And with my titles blog at Writer on Blocks, there's a link to get a list of 500 titles that I analysed. So you too, if you benefit like I do from copying other people's examples, then click that link, download the 500 titles and use them to spark your creativity. Another thing you might have missed at the Story a Day website this week, storyaday.org, there was an article that we put together with the Superstars group. We just sort of crowdsourced. One of our discussions was romantic things that people have done for us. It sort of came up organically in conversation, and people were talking about things that their significant other or people, important people in their life had done for them as writers that may not have seemed like a big deal to the person doing it, but for us made us swoon. So one of our community, Michelle Reisinger, put together a lovely article about the 5 most romantic things that you can do for the writer in your life. So I highly encourage you to open that, read it, leave it open in a browser so that the people you live with can accidentally see it, or forward it to them so that the people in your life can understand what it is that we writers truly appreciate. Beyond notebooks and pens. Those are in there, those are on the list. That's not really a spoiler, but there's some other things on the list that people might not realise are just the most romantic things you can do for a writer. So that's another article for you to read. And finally, I wanted to bring to your attention an article that I enjoyed earlier in the year. And it's one from Srinivas Rao, who is the host of the Unmistakable Creative podcast. And I will put a link to this article in the notes as well. But it's something that I think is important as we approach this change in the season. If you're doing a little reflection on what just passed and a little planning for what's to come, this article is a really interesting one because it's called The Essential Skill We Should Have Learned in Childhood That Impacts Adulthood. And it's I'm going to spoil it and give away the punchline, but it's not actually. It's about risk. It's about our tolerance for risk. A lot of us have been raised in an environment where we are encouraged to play it safe in a way. And I think to be creative and to be a writer, we need to shed some of that. When I was younger, I was fortunate to have friends who were musicians and artists at quite a high level. And I remember being involved with them as they went on to tertiary education and talking with them about things like how you grade. Like, how do you get graded at college when you're a musician or an artist? You're making jewellery or you're playing a piano sonata. I mean, you can't really get 100%, or how can you get 10 out of 10? The scale for judging people is just different. If you're studying science or math, you can conceivably get 100% by getting all of the answers right. But to get 100% on something as subjective as a piano recital or by making jewellery, it's just a different thing. You have to be willing to pour your heart into an endeavour and have people not like it. So this article on risk tolerance is a really good one for helping you think about the fact that not just rejection, which we talk about a lot in the writing world, but the idea of safety comes up. If you ever wonder why, when you sit down to write, you suddenly feel a burning urge to do laundry or clean the fridge or sharpen your pencils or call your mother, it's because those things are safe. Whereas trying to write, trying to be the thing that you most dearly want to be, which is a creative, communicative, talented writer who has the ability to move people, that's not a sure thing when you sit down at the page. It's not a sure thing even if you're writing, and probably if you're writing a first draft, it seems like the furthest thing from a sure thing. So we suddenly discover that we have to clean the kitchen floor, or call our friend, or browse Facebook, because those things have a predictable outcome. We know how they're going to make us feel. We know they're not going to make us feel rejected. So safety is one of the things that we don't often think about when we worry about writer's block and things like that. So I would highly recommend taking a look at this article, which I'm also going to post a link to in the blog, in the podcast notes. And think about how to be kind to yourself. If you're going to undertake this seasonal reflection that I suggested at the beginning of the podcast, how will you do that with this understanding that what we're doing is risky and difficult and rewarding and thrilling, but yes, will make us feel uncomfortable. Anyway, that's what I have for you this week. Some resources, some interesting articles, and a fervent wish that you are kind to yourself in this change of seasons and enter into the next season just with joy and creativity and excitement. Thanks for listening. Why not come over to the blog at storyaday.org and check out this week's writing prompts and articles. And in the meantime, have a great creative week, and of course, keep writing.